guys, I'm Fancy.
And I'm Colleen.
And this is Murder by Design. Okay, guys, so we have some very, very special guests with us tonight. So on with us today is, and I'm sorry, my dogs seem to be barking in the background, but they should be fine. On with us today is a career prosecuting attorney, Carlos Monagas. He is a Bolt Hall of Law School, UC Berkeley graduate. He has served as a longtime prosecutor with the Crimes Against Children Unit and has recently been supervising a homicide prosecution team. Of course, my dogs are going crazy. A homicide prosecution team and my personal friend of 30 plus years. So thank you for joining us today, Carlos.
Thank you.
And then weighing in for the defense is one of our regular correspondents and most loved by our listeners, Kirk Nurmi. Kirk is a University of Wyoming Law School graduate. He served as a deputy public defender from 2001 to 2011 and was death penalty certified in 2007. And drawing the short end of the stick, he was the lead defense attorney for Miss Jodi Arias. Kirk is a 7-time published author, a regular guest on Crime Stories with Nancy Grace and Court TV, and has his own show on Get Vocal called Kirk's Court, beginning on 8/13/2020. So welcome to the show again, Kirk Nurmi.
Thank you, ladies. It's good to be back, although I feel like there's a dog back there that has a lot to say. Should be given the floor.
Yes, he's about this big, and he thinks he's like this one.
I have one. I'm familiar. I have one of those sitting in my house right now.
That almost is and his name representative of the case we're talking about today.
Yes,
case for the dogs.
Yes. He thinks he's casebook for the dogs, right? Exactly. So, well, thank you guys. I think he's quiet now. He's had his say, so we'll give you guys some time here. Colleen, let's tell them what we're talking about today.
So tonight, guys, we talked a little about this earlier this week, and throughout the past few weeks, we're talking about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. So last week was the file dump regarding Miss Maxwell. She has been arrested after years of evading the police. As we all know, Jeffrey Epstein did not commit suicide in prison a year or so ago. So then the case kind of like stalled out, waiting to find Miss Maxwell and to continue, the investigation. It was happening behind the scenes, but since she was arrested because she's an idiot and got cocky and came back to this country, she has been arrested and is in jail. And she tried to file a last-minute motion to not have these documents published, but they were. And but it's barely even scratching the surface of the amount of documents they have. It was just like a 2,400-page document that was released. There was supposed to be another file dump on Monday that has been delayed. It hasn't happened yet. I'm watching very closely, waiting for it. And so it's exciting. We got to know a lot more information in those documents about who was involved, where things were involved. And unfortunately, somebody in the legal office is getting in big trouble for it was supposed to be redacted, but somebody made an error. And by what happened was, so they redacted it, I think, just on the computer. And if you copied the redacted portion, so the blacked out portion, and copied it into Notepad and changed the highlight, then you could see the words in the document. So it was essentially not redacted. And I'm sure thousands of people are pissed that their information is now out there. And I doubt that will happen again in the next file dump. But we were able to learn a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So thinking about that, guys, Kirk and Carlos both, have you ever seen something like that happen before, where that error has been made? And what do you feel like that is going to have a bearing on this case on either the prosecution or defense side?
Well, I guess I could speak to that. The reality, I think, is that that with technology, lawyers and court staff, like a lot of kind of normal citizens, are getting used to the technology. So I think we see it in cases every once in a while where people just through inadvertence fail to redact or believe they redact, but haven't mastered the technology. So unfortunately, it's not uncommon to see human errors when documents are being redacted and released. We try not to do it. Certainly, I think prosecutors as well as defense attorneys and court staff know that we have a responsibility to protect people and to always abide by court orders. If a judge orders a redaction, gosh darn it, we're supposed to do it. But unfortunately, there's probably somebody out there who is beside themselves at realizing that they committed an inadvertent error. So I feel badly for whoever it is that's responsible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these things that's going to have to play itself out. Carlos is right. You do your best you can, and somebody can figure out, because it sounds like this was like not a matter of not redacting. It was a matter of not knowing that certain things could be done to uncover, right? It's kind of like a hack of the redaction. So, people make their best efforts in that regard. Carlos is absolutely correct. The question becomes, not so much related to Miss Maxwell, perhaps, but as it relates to all these other people, is their reputation and ability to receive a fair trial, has that been tainted by this disclosure, this premature disclosure of this evidence? And maybe are they witnesses that have been maybe tainted now that might get lawyers, not knowing they were involved now, seeing that they're involved, and they might not be as forthcoming of a witness if they fear their own kind of criminal liability, which I think Carlos would probably agree that could make prosecution difficult down the road if witnesses start becoming less cooperative or less forthcoming.
Mm-hmm. And I think that when you're putting the case together or police are conducting an investigation, it's important to keep information close to the vest. The idea being that you don't want to unfairly influence witnesses. You want to talk to witnesses directly based on what they personally know. And then you keep in mind too that all of us have an obligation, I say as prosecutors, to try a case in the courtroom and never in the court of public opinion.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that that information related to the case is kept within the confines of the courtroom and court filings and that sort of thing, it's what you want to do. Because I have an obligation as a prosecutor, as do prosecutors across this country, to protect the rights of the accused, to protect the rights of witnesses, but also to ensure that the rights kind of all the players in the court process are protected, and that includes the defendant.
Exactly. And before I start listing the big names, one thing that we did notice right away was the names of all these highly powerful men and women were redacted, but the officers and investigators of the case, their names and addresses were not redacted. How does that put those investigators at risk?
Well, look, and Carlos kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, the court of public opinion here, and especially, in the social media era, having dealt with the Arias case, which I think we can all agree is pretty prominent, and particularly, like I always say, right up there with OJ and Casey Anthony, only in the social media era. And that allows for the various parties that Carlos was talking about to become vulnerable. We saw in the Arias trial jurors being followed home, things of that nature, this thirst for information and this quest for interviews and whatever they can get on someone. And I think becomes particularly because, like I was telling Fancy yesterday in a message, I started watching she got me sucked into the Epstein thing on Netflix there. And one of the things we saw that I would be concerned about if I was prosecuting this case is the fact that Epstein and his lawyers and things, have been involved in intimidating witnesses, right? We have them outside of one of the victims' houses with a private investigator, things like that. Mm-hmm. So it could be very problematic if that kind of pressure is on some of those individuals. It's probably easier to put that on a young, fragile woman than a seasoned investigator, he's still there, and it still has to be a concern because the tentacles go so far. I mean, people were finding where people's kids went to areas trial, and we had a guy with a DUI that was none of anybody's business that was on the jury, right? But it's front page news, and that becomes a problematic because, again, I think defense attorneys and prosecutors both want to try a case in a courtroom, not in the court of public opinion, and it does become the court of public opinion that weighs in on some of these cases before they even see the courtroom, oftentimes,
Right.
and this is what we're seeing in this case.
Right. Well, so one of our listeners, Elaine Varian, she's asking a really interesting question, and I think this is so she's talking about a speedy trial here, and I really do think that the public might have a misunderstanding of what a speedy trial really means. So her question is, why arrest Ghislaine Maxwell now when the trial is at least a year out? Is that not a speedy trial? They knew where she was for at least months, so can one of you, perhaps Carlos, can you start with talking about what really defines a speedy trial and why they would have made that choice to arrest a suspect at this time after, it's been a long time that the case has been open, and now they're arresting her, and her court date that they're saying for the trial is at least 1 year out. So.
Yeah, of course. So I think it's important to understand how the life of a criminal case progresses. It begins with the criminal investigation by law enforcement. Sometimes suspects do not know that they are the target of a police investigation. So they go about their everyday lives not knowing that somewhere out there's an investigative team looking into actions that they may have committed in the past. Sometimes, like in this case, the suspect may have been involved in a set of behaviors or actions that are known publicly, that people know about and that the suspect knows are being looked into. But whether the suspect is aware of the investigation or whether or not, the criminal court process doesn't begin until a criminal complaint has been filed by a prosecutor's office or an indictment has been secured via grand jury. So in this case, I imagine that law enforcement investigated at some point. The prosecutor's office reviewed the facts as they relayed to Ms. Maxwell and determined that there was sufficient evidence to justify moving forward with charges. Once they secured their indictment, that began the criminal case, and that led to her arrest. Her first day in court, when she was arraigned and pled not guilty to that charging document, that was day one of the court process. At that point is when her speedy trial rights begin. There are both statutory rights as well as, I suppose, some constitutional due process protections that let us know where the backstop is for when the trial happens. But an accused defendant has some control over how long it takes to trial in this respect. They have the ability to waive time in order to prepare for their own defense, or they have the right to insist on those statutory time requirements being adhered to. If you imagine perhaps your typical speedy trial rights being so many days to a probable cause hearing and then so many days to trial, imagine a situation where speedy trial rights might be 6 months. If I don't waive time, I've got a right to a jury trial in 60 days or in 6 months. When we hear people talking about the trial being out a year from the date of the arraignment, that typically indicates to me that both the prosecution and the defense have been willing to waive time in order to properly prepare for trial. And it's a decision that a defendant has to make in consultation with their lawyer. Do we want to go to trial right away and enforce our speedy trial rights? Or are we willing tactically to waive some time and allow that trial to happen a little bit later so that I, as the accused, can be prepared to meet the evidence so that I can do my own investigation and prepare for my defense? But the arrest happens the moment the criminal charges are initiated. Some defendants have the ability to post bail and be out of custody during that time, and other defendants remain in custody. And I suppose that would be another long discussion for us to talk about kind of bail structure and own reconnaissance release, maybe a conversation for another day.
Well, and I think she's essentially a flight risk with having dual citizenship and
Right.
the wealth to be able to leave this country.
Now, Kirk, Cloyd Steiger, our homicide detective that we had on earlier this week to talk about some of the investigative side of this, he kind of had a response to this in the fact that a lot of times it's and Carlos kind of just touched on this. A lot of times it's the defense that holds up the court case more often than the prosecution side because of, different various options. Is that something that you do? You can elaborate on a little bit?
Well, I take issue with the verbiage "hold up." That does sound like a cop saying it, right? But I would say this: what's more important than a speedy trial is a fair one. And the problem is in a case like this, and I have no idea how many witnesses there are, that sort of thing. I mean, there's got to be hundreds, right? And so and what federal statutes might also have different time frames because like in Arizona, and I don't know if Carlos says this in California, but there were complex case litigation. There would be extended periods of time in order to prepare for a case this massive, right? Death penalty cases were also always an exception to the speedy trial. Once the clock Carlos started talking about ran, it was a much longer till it expired on a death penalty case than it would a normal case. And I think this is kind of akin to that, right? Because the defense attorneys are going to want to make sure that they get a fair trial. Because somebody could complain, hey, what about my speedy trial rights, blah, blah, blah. And we probably, defense attorneys are probably hearing that a lot now. And Carlos might be hearing that a lot now in the courtroom every day when with COVID shut down the courts, right? I want my speedy trial, I want my speedy trial. But one thing my retort I always to my client was well, you can have a speedy trial and get convicted, or we can go about the right way and have a fair trial and really hold the state to their burden of proving it beyond a reasonable doubt. And in Miss Maxwell's case, I don't see why, she would want to try to speed through this because the state is always has the advantage, because they have had, apart from the advantage of, the flag and all that stuff behind them, waving behind them in truth and justice, is the idea that they have been on this case for a year, maybe a year and a half, right? Depending on like a case like this, it's probably been several years, right? Since the first reports came in, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things are going on that the prosecutor and the police, whatever investigative agencies are involved in the case, they know all this stuff, and then they charge the case. And then at least in Arizona, I don't know how it works in federal court, then somebody backs up a truck with, 20,000 pages of documents and says, here you go, and here's my witness list of 200 people. It's just impossible for a defense attorney to be adequately prepared on that kind of timeline to provide a fair trial.
Well, right, we see that happen in our executive branch of government with, when file documents are released. We saw it in many of the Supreme Court hearings, but also Senate confirmations that we were just provided a 6,000 page document last night at midnight. It is now 8:30 in the morning. I have had no time to actually read this. I'm not prepared to continue today's hearing because you didn't give me that adequate time to read these documents. And from what we've seen, and I want to say this has to be the most minuscule amount of files in relation to how many files this case must actually have, that it's probably over. I'm going to throw a ballpark of 20,000 plus pages of documents.
Easily.
And so the people involved in this case, and we don't have to talk about individually, how we go about them, but I'm curious on how a defense and a prosecution, how it would work in general with some of these people. So the attorney questioning Virginia, one of the main witnesses, had asked, other than Glenn Dubin, Stephen Kaufman, Prince Andrew, Jean-Luc Burnell from Victoria's Secret, Bill Richardson, the former governor of New Mexico, which we did talk about on Monday because Epstein owned a ranch in New Mexico. Another prince of Spain, the large hotel chain owner, which after reviewing the unredacted documents, we have seen that is Richard Hilton, Paris Hilton's dad, former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, and that the famous attorney Alan Dershowitz, and then Marvin Minsky. Is there anyone else that Maxwell directed you to have sex with? And she had said, I'm definitely sure there is, but I can't remember everybody's names. There's too many. So these are some very prominent people. So obviously we have celebrities. We've got people from other countries. We've got people all across our country. How does a court case work when it's people that are lawyers? So how would a prosecutor
or government officials? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, they don't have.
Start.
Oh, go ahead, Carlos, please.
Well, I guess I'll start, and if you don't mind, I'll turn it over to you. But
Sure.
Investigators are going to build a case exactly the same, whether a witness or a suspect is a celebrity, a person of wealth, or a regular Joe with a 8 to 5 job. You follow the evidence, you interview witnesses, you collect facts. Ultimately, if you find that there is sufficient evidence to justify charges, whether that celebrity that you're talking about is a witness or a defendant, you're going to determine whether or not it's appropriate to file criminal charges. Now, if the person who is the suspect of the investigation is somebody who lives overseas, then the practical question for prosecutors is, can we assert jurisdiction over that person? Certainly, if the crime occurred within the prosecutor's jurisdiction, say an Arizona prosecutor for an Arizona crime or a federal prosecutor here in the United States for a federal crime, then you've got jurisdiction to prosecute here. But the question is, can you actually compel the suspect to be brought to the United States? Extradition is something that can be pursued, but we oftentimes see situations where warrants are in the system. In other words, a case has been filed against somebody who lives overseas, and that warrant sits there until the person perhaps visits the United States. Authorities become aware of it, and now when they're physically within the jurisdiction of the prosecutors, the arrest is made. So if we're talking generally about cases where maybe a suspect is somebody who is overseas, that's how it would work out. Do we have enough evidence to file? And then the question is, do we have the legal capacity to compel them to come here? Or do we just put a warrant in the system and wait for their return to happen? And those are difficult conversations to have with victims of crime. Imagine a situation where we believe you, we believe there's enough evidence, we have filed a case, but now we have to wait to see what happens.
That would be like that would be similar to like Roman Polanski, right? Something like that with him, where he's avoided prosecution for years and years and years because he's gone overseas. Yeah,
certainly, yeah, and that's somebody who had suffered a conviction, and so that aspect had already been resolved in the courts, and the question was, whether the person would actually begin serving that sentence. But absolutely, we've seen it happen before in high-profile cases.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I just thought of that as you were talking. So, and I wanted to give
no, that's okay
for our listeners.
But I began by stepping on Kirk. I apologize to him.
No, Carlos. You know what? I'm glad you went first, because your comments I would agree with the bulk, and it triggered a thought in me as well. We have to remember the lawyer pursuing some of the charges or some of the monetary gains. He called, in the Netflix special, he referred to this as a pyramid of pedophilia, which I think is a great way to put it, right? And we have to look at this in different fashions also when we talk about Fifth Amendment right. So let's say we have and I'm going to use Bill Richardson as an example, right? Let's say victim says that whoever the victim was you read off says, well, Giselle, Miss Maxwell had me have sex with Bill Richardson at this United States to take that issue out of it on this particular day. And that's a charge hearing that Miss Maxwell is facing. Mm-hmm. Well, if Mr. Richardson's involved in that, he's going to say, I'm going to invoke my right to against self-incrimination, because he might, if I say, hey, Bill Richardson says, I couldn't have been having sex with her in New Mexico because I was at a conference in California on this, or what have you. And you're looking for documents to prove it. You're looking for any kind of correlation, and they're not going to be cooperative. So then, you've got a defense attorney saying, I can't get a fair trial because Ms. Maxwell's being accused of doing this. Mr. Richardson and his counsel are claiming the Fifth Amendment in order to get documents, and maybe there's some cohesion, maybe there's not, maybe there's a contrast, right, in certain cases. So it just starts taking more and more time to say, for everyone to get a fair trial. And Miss Maxwell, because of this, now I'm not saying she's innocent, but because of this pyramid that has been built, you think about all these parts and working to ensure she gets a fair trial. We talked earlier about a year. I think this thing is going to take years to get into court.
Yes.
if it goes together, because you're going to have so many witnesses and so many documents and everything like that. Each one of these prominent people is going to be trying to evade it, not wanting to offer testimony that helps Miss Maxwell in any way, Fifth Amendment. And if enough people claim their Fifth Amendment rights, and Miss Maxwell says, hey, they're exculpatory witnesses to me, then the argument becomes, I can't get a fair trial because the witnesses that would support my innocence have claimed Fifth Amendment privilege. And that just, again, it just starts to snowball. And when you're talking about prominent people, Carlos is right. There's no difference in terms of the pursuit or the rights they have. But there is a difference in the fact that John, who works at the grocery store, is probably not going to have 5 lawyers working for him the way Mr. Hilton might. We'll switch to Mr. Hilton, right? He's probably got 20. Right. So you've got, little old me, maybe I'm the defender for Miss Maxwell, and, I've got to try to fight 20 lawyers just to get some documents, and I got to go to the court and say, Judge, you got to compel them, and then they come in and fight, and then it takes forever.
Well, and I think when we talk about how many, witnesses are involved in this, just think for, one of these prominent people, that they all I'm going to go Dershowitz. Dershowitz has a law office. All of his friends, the people who work at his law office, his many secretaries, you have his co-workers. Where was he on this day? Where was let's look at his file book. Was he on this vacation? Then his family, because he has been very public about this case on his own social media and on news channels. And he's written op-eds in newspapers about it. So then you get, the people who work for those. He has said that he was on the island, but it was only with his wife and grandkids. Okay, well, now you have to interview his wife and grandkids. You have to interview all of the girls who are available, who are on that island and can say, no, he was not there with his wife and grandkids. He abused me. And then he, just this past week, has gone on Fox News and was defending himself in that same sense, and has defended his plea deal about him being not able to be prosecuted because he was part of the plea deal, even though he was involved. But he was defending that. So then you have the people who are involved in that interview. So just for one person, I can imagine at least 50 or more, witnesses or statements that have to be made for one of them. And, that's just, Dershowitz. But right, we go to Richard Hilton, he owns hundreds of hotels, hundreds of thousands of employees, family members, coworkers. I mean, I 100% believe that this case is going to take years and years of just litigation to be able to get the documents needed to be able to prosecute and run this trial in general.
So based on that, I'm going to have Carlos answer and then Kirk the same question. So would you, if this was your type of case, would you be looking at this, thinking of all those things, and would you be looking to maybe plead it out faster so that some sort of justice quicker, and maybe, yes, it would be a lesser charge or lesser people prosecuted, but would you be looking to that? And if so, would you just be focusing on Ghislaine, or would you be looking to kind of make a blanket deal with many different people involved in this case?
So I guess I'll begin by pointing this out. You've mentioned some different names of people. None of those people have been charged with a crime.
Right. Correct.
And so it's
Right.
important for us to remember that Ms. Maxwell remains the only named defendant
Charged.
in this case.
Yep.
And so as a prosecutor, as you review a case and make determination as to whether or not you're going to file a case, you need to ask yourself, what admissible evidence do I have? What evidence would I expect would be available and legally admissible for me to present to a judge or a jury? And so I'm confident that the federal prosecutors in Ms. Maxwell's case have gone through that analysis and asked themselves, do I have sufficient admissible evidence in order to prosecute this? So, for example, Kirk spoke to the fact that there are some of the names we've mentioned that might assert Fifth Amendment rights and refuse to cooperate in the prosecution. 100% correct. And so what I would imagine is that the prosecutors are focused at this point on their one charged defendant and the evidence, the admissible evidence that you have involving that person. What that means as a practical matter is that sometimes there may be more criminality surrounding an offense, but prosecutors sometimes are left to target one defendant at a time and resolve that case. You ask about whether or not a prosecutor would be inclined to seek a plea deal early. That is a question that only the assigned prosecutors on each individual case can keep in mind. I will say this for myself, and this is me as an individual who's had a career in criminal law. When you charge a case, it should be because you believe the person's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and because the charges that you have selected are charges you believe are correct. In other words, you don't overcharge a case. You don't charge a dollar's worth of charges for 25 cents worth of crime. So if you've done the analysis that has led you to conclude these are the appropriate charges, and if you've done the analysis that leads you to conclude I have sufficient evidence, admissible evidence to prove these charges on my criminal complaint, then at that point, as a prosecutor, you set out your goals for the prosecution. What are the consequences that I think are appropriate for this conduct and for these charges? And once you've selected what you believe are the appropriate consequences, I don't know that there is an incentive to somehow abandon those goals of the prosecution for the sole purpose of just wrapping it up quick. And also keep in mind that both in federal court as well as in many state courts, including California, victims have a seat at the table and they've got rights as well. So as a prosecutor, before I would ever seek out a plea deal or enter into a plea deal, one of the people I'm going to have to talk to are the victims. Here are the charges. Here's what the defense proposed as a resolution of the case. So plead guilty to these charges and accept this punishment. What do you think? Now, as a prosecutor, the law entrusts me with the ultimate responsibility to enter into a plea negotiation. It leaves it with me. It is my responsibility with, of course, the agreement and blessing of the court once the deal is struck. But the most important people that contribute to that decision, the most important feedback that I'm going to seek as a prosecutor is from the victims. And so it appears, based on the finding earlier, that there was a violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act in an earlier Epstein prosecution. One of the things that it appears perhaps that prosecutors have done in the past is not honor their obligation to speak to victims and to make sure that they seek the input and allow them an opportunity to be heard in the process. So I would imagine that the prosecutors here have learned that lesson, and that they're going to be very sensitive to make sure that whatever they do as far as resolving the case is with the input of the victims, and that at least as far as the victims are concerned, it's a process that's more transparent for them, where they have an opportunity to kind of give their input and decide. So would I expect an early resolution of the case? No. And in jurisdictions across the country, I think sex crimes prosecutors that protect children, have this conversation with kids and their families on the day that they meet them. We file the criminal charges, and it's going to be a long process with us together. And there'll be times when it feels like the case is moving fast, and sometimes when you feel that maybe the defendant has more rights than you do in the criminal justice process. But whether you think we're moving fast or slow, I can fairly guarantee you that the earliest that we're going to be inside a trial department is in about a year and a half. About 1 year to year and a half would be a pretty swift moving child abuse case in most jurisdictions. And so the process and the conversation that I'm sure prosecutors are having with now the adult victims in this particular case is similar to that. It's going to be a long process. We'll communicate with you all the way through and answer your questions and educate you along the way. But I wouldn't expect for us to be inside of the trial department to resolve this case anytime within the next 12 months. It'll probably be a year from now that we're back together talking about realistic trial dates. And that's kind of how I would envision a prosecution like this to move forward.
Well, Kirk, right before you start, just for our listeners, I believe that the plea deal that you're talking about was in. We lost.
Oh wait, hold on. He's back. Hold on.
Okay.
There we go. No, add to stream. There we go.
I think the plea deal that you were talking about was regards to the Palm Beach trial and his plea deal that allowed him to serve. I think it was, maybe a year in prison, but Monday through Saturday, he was allowed to go to work during the day and just had to return at night. And then he was, after that period of time, he was able to get out. Is that right?
Yeah, and that's public information. So yes, I was referring to that experience, and I guess I would cite that as an example of why it's so important for prosecutors to ensure that the rights of the victims are respected throughout the process, and that we communicate with them effectively, and that we allow them that opportunity to give input. Like I said, ultimately, it is the prosecutor's responsibility. The law sets it on the prosecutor's desk whether or not to enter into a negotiated disposition, what you might call a plea deal. But we have to do that with the input of the victims. So in the initial question, kind of the suggestion was, hey, would the prosecutor want to get out of this case early by just resolving it and wrapping it up? I don't think so, because you can imagine that this was probably a decision that was not lightly taken to file criminal charges, and this is one where they have multiple victims they're going to be interacting with. So I would imagine that they've committed to see the prosecution through.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, if I could just piggyback on what Carlos is saying and encourage him to move to Arizona, because we need more prosecutors like him in Arizona as to some of the more aggressive and dismissive types that we have. So I commend him for his service in California, and thank you, sir. But to kind of, just like I said, piggyback on that, we have to also keep in mind that there's different jurisdictions here. We're talking about federal crimes and state crimes, okay? So as the defense attorney, I might be taking a different approach depending on how involved. If we're just talking about the full charges, and Carlos is a prosecutor and we've known each other for a while, I'd probably pick up the phone and say, what's your goal here? What are you looking for here? Because some prosecutors might be thinking, I want to get the people that had sex with the minors. That's what I want. And now a federal prosecutor might not be thinking that, but the state prosecutors he's in communication with might say, I want to get everybody that had the sex with these minors because that's the most important offense.
Yep.
So if that was the goal, I'd be saying, okay, look, Miss Maxwell, and I know that she's accused of having some sexual contact with some of these girls as well, but I might say, okay, if that's what you want, there's only one person that can give it to you. Okay. Mm-hmm. So why don't we start talking about a deal? Because I'd want to know what his goals and his aims are. And each involved in this prosecution, or the jurisdiction where these sex acts happen, they have vested interest in that as well. So the poor federal prosecutor there has got a lot of interest to compete with. But depending on what the goal is, right? If the goal is just to lock Miss Maxwell away, okay, then Carlos and I don't need to talk about it anymore, right? But if the goal is to get some of those other cases resolved and get everybody involved, all these named parties, if that's the desire, then we have something to talk about. Then there could be a resolution. But I think I wouldn't be talking about it openly in public. I'd be working behind the scenes because, I wouldn't want anyone to know, because we know what happened to Mr. Epstein, and I wouldn't want anybody to know that my
she's going to
client
turn
is becoming a cooperating witness. It's out there in the ethers enough. So I mean, especially like, Miss Maxwell's case, she's probably looking at life in prison the rest of her life, depending on how many charges there are. So I'm looking to try to judge where he's at and what we could do, because it's true. Carlos is right. You got to look out for the victims and those type of things. What do they want? Do they want resolution to the sex? Do they just want to get Miss Maxwell? What is their desire? Is it reasonable, right? And then moving forward from there to see what you can do, because I don't think Carlos and I, if we're on opposing sides of this case, are going to want to spend 3 years in trial if we can avoid it, right? 3 years in trial that maybe doesn't even allow for the conviction of some of the people that actually had sex.
Right.
And I guess, so what I think is a big deal, which it's so behind the scenes that we're not going to be able to know this information until it comes out, was what we do know, that Maxwell and Epstein kept very, very detailed records of every interaction with all of, these clients and people and the girls. And it has been said that Epstein was, I think he was intelligent, and he knew he needed dirt on people, that he had cameras in every single angle of every room running 24/7. So potentially somewhere out there, if it hasn't been destroyed already, there is a massive hard drive or tapes of these prominent individuals assaulting minors. And I think, Carlos, is that pretty much a gold mine for prosecutors to be able to charge these defendants?
Yes. Technology helps. I think there was a shift in law enforcement investigations when all of us transitioned our lives to kind of digital assistance, cell phones, computers, home surveillance systems. That allows us to collect evidence that before police officers didn't have access to because it didn't exist. Now, the question here, and we're 100% speculating, is whether or not that evidence exists and whether or not federal investigators were able to obtain it. Now, if that evidence does exist and prosecutors have it and it pertains to Ms. Maxwell, well, then one of the things that we know is that through the discovery process, Ms. Maxwell is going to have a right to view that information and to be able to examine it and know exactly how strong the prosecutor's case is. In a criminal trial, we're playing poker. But the difference is this: Kirk is allowed to shield his cards and play them as he sees fit. Heck, he could even bluff and lie to me a little bit in order to get me to misplay my cards. The law requires me, though, to show mine. So I have to show all my cards to the defense. So defense counsel knows what cards I have in the order in which I'm probably going to play them. And so knowing that, and by the way, I should say, and if I've done my job as a prosecutor, I've done the analysis as far as what is the state of my evidence and have I charged the case appropriately, it's okay that defense counsel knows all my evidence and all my cards, because I should still be able to win in court, because the evidence should be such that it's beyond a reasonable doubt. But the reason I kind of go into this tangent here is because if there is the possibility of a negotiated disposition that turns Ms. Maxwell into a cooperating witness, now's the time that she would be looking at that evidence with her attorneys and asking themselves, do we swing for the fences, go scorched earth, and attempt to secure an acquittal on all charges? Or do we reach out to the prosecutor and start to discuss the possibility what dispositions are available. And Kirk's right. If we're attorneys that have a good working relationship, he's going to call me up and he's going to ask me, what are your goals for this prosecution? And are you interested? Are you open to the idea of talking to my client about maybe receiving a lesser sentence in exchange for cooperation? And that's sometimes why cases get put out for a year at the outset, because the attorneys recognize that there's some analysis that needs to be done and then some discussions that need to be done. And so I would not be surprised if that's what's happening sort of behind the scenes, as it should. These are not discussions that should ever be done in public. And in fact, as a prosecutor, I always get nervous when we have discussions about specific facts, any prosecutor anywhere in the country, in public, because that's not where we should be doing our job. And the reality is that witnesses, victims, and the accused have a right to juries that aren't tainted by Netflix specials and people doing press conferences on courthouse steps.
So Kirk kind of brought up a point that I would like to have you expand on, Carlos, being that you were a longtime prosecuting attorney that specialized in crimes against children. If this were your case, what would be your goal with it? Would it be to just, would it be just laying, or would it be that larger get of really putting people behind bars that actually did the deeds to these children?
Hypothetically, if it was.
Hypothetically, yeah.
Yes, of course, hypothetically.
Or a similar case.
I'll tell you, I'll answer the question by speaking 100% for myself. I would imagine that other crimes against children prosecutors across the country, heck, across the world, might feel the same way. But I'm gonna give you an answer that is 100% kind of my gut, where I'm at. The reality is that crimes against children, especially sex offenses against children, I think are some of the worst crimes that people can commit. Because what an offender like that does is destroy a person. You destroy their spirit. You leave somebody where for the rest of their lives, they don't know if they can love correctly, if they can trust correctly. And to break someone's spirit, I think in some ways is worse than murder, if that makes sense.
You say that all the time.
A murder
we
victim,
talk about this all the time on this case.
A murder victim suffers, and then hopefully their suffering is over. But for some child victims of sexual assault, that crime stays with them for the rest of their lives. And so that is part of the, just one of the worst things a human being can do to another. So as a sex crimes prosecutor in the time that I was working on a trial team protecting children, what we look at, or what I used to look at, is what is the risk of reoffense, and what harm are they kind of involved with. And so here we have a situation, theoretically, right, where somebody is facilitating the procurement of children, who is participating in the sexual assault of children. And so then you have to ask yourself, is that less culpable than the person who's doing the sex act, the person that recruits and delivers? And I don't know that the answer is no. She is less morally and criminally culpable. So so I could see a situation where a prosecutor looks at Miss Maxwell's alleged conduct, or somebody in her position, and says, that's my heavy. That is the person that, but for her, there are victims who are never victimized, who are never molested, who are never sexually violated, but for her conduct. So so I could see, and again, I don't know, I'm speculating, but I could see, I would not be surprised if the prosecutor's office says, you know what, no, we've decided that our goal for this defendant is maximum punishment for these charges, and so be it. But then I can also, I don't know all the facts. I don't know all the evidence. So
sure.
Perhaps there's more information that leads prosecutors to decide, no, it's worth working with her. But think about the conduct that we're talking about. And, one of the most important things for law enforcement to do is not to enter into a deal with a big fish in order to get a smaller fish. Does that make sense? And that's a process.
Yes,
That's an
absolutely.
analysis that investigators, prosecutors, and in consultation with the victims, that's a decision they'll have to make.
Right. Okay.
Kirk, rebuttal.
Well, I don't know. There's so much rebuttal. I mean, I think that is the consideration you have to make, and with the consultation of everybody involved to say, you know, there was a supplier and there was a demand. What do we want to do about it? And how do state prosecutors feel about that sort of thing? You know, I did sex cases for years as well, and never did I encounter a situation like this where we're talking about this sort of procurement or what have you, right? This sort of pyramid scheme. I'll go back to that one. This sort of pyramid scheme, right? Of all these offenders. So, yeah, I mean, there's no real rebuttal. It's just what's in the prosecutor's mind is to say, you know, it's the most gruesome or grisly supply and demand kind of situation you can make, right? And then another thing that goes into that analysis is, how likely would there be a conviction for some of these people who had this demand without Miss Maxwell's testimony, right? Could they go off scot-free if Miss Maxwell doesn't testify? And how do the victims feel about that, right? So there's all those kind of factors coming into it, and I think, you know, Carlos is exactly right. So yeah, no need for rebuttal today.
So I know this is a question that is going to come up.
If I could just add to that too.
Go ahead,
Kirk's.
No, go ahead. Carlos, did we lose you? Uh-oh. Did you hit mute? Carlos? I think I can still hear you. I can't hear you talking though. Oh no. Are you still there, Carlos?
I am. Are we back?
Okay.
Yes, yeah, you're back. You're back. There you are.
Great.
Yes. Okay.
So
go ahead and come back.
For people who do this work on a day-to-day basis, we have candid conversations. So, you know, the defense attorneys defend the accused because they've taken an oath to represent the rights of the accused and to defend zealously. But that doesn't mean that the defense attorneys cannot objectively look at facts and then have negotiation discussions. So it's I've had conversations where defense attorneys have told me, hey, I understand the culpability of my client, and I am not, I'm wide-eyed about what exactly my client did and the evidence you have, but have you considered this? And they weigh the case and the harm to the victims exactly like a prosecutor would, in order to hopefully convince me to perhaps engage in an agreement with their client in order to together work on identifying and prosecuting other suspects. So these are all conversations that pretty candid conversations we have when we're talking about our career criminal prosecutors and career criminal defense attorneys.
Okay,
right.
Fantastic. So we're getting close to the end here. We kind of need to wrap it up. So Colleen, did you have anything else you really wanted to make sure that we asked before we let these two gentlemen go? Yeah. Okay.
So a question that I know is going to come up at some point with all of these people. How will the court system get around a conflict of interest and finding a team on both sides that could prosecute and defend these, not just Maxwell, but if there are charges brought against these other people that have been named? Obviously, everybody knows somebody, and a lawyer, a prosecutor and defense trying to prosecute and defend another lawyer, or prosecuting and defending somebody they've worked with or somebody they're friends with. Who is responsible for making sure that there's no conflict of interest in the people who are representing these the witnesses and the defendants?
Well, I'll take this one just because as a defense attorney, that would be where the conflicts of most arise. It's up to the defense attorney and it's up to the court. If the defense attorney feels for some reason that they cannot defend a certain person, because for whatever reason it might be, because they have personal relationship with, or they were a former client, something like that, because that's something that really no one else is going to know. Like,
right.
if I represented Mr. Dershowitz at one point in time, and then I represented Mr. Hilton, and for some reason the evidence shows that they have a conflict of interest, I would go to the court, at least this is how it happened in Arizona. I would go to the presiding judge and say, listen, this is my problem. I can't have this case. I need to withdraw. And then new counsel is assigned. That's in the case of indigent defense, right? But it works pretty much the same way with a private counsel. Say, listen, I have this relationship. I don't think I can take this case. Or if they take the case and it's questioned for some reason, the prosecutor knows something. He says, okay, court, step in and decide whether Mr. Nurmi can represent this person or not. Mm-hmm. And I think it's one of those things where it's probably easier than it seems because, us hated criminal defense attorneys, we're running around all over the place. So there's going to be someone that knows nothing about any of these cases that's completely competent to represent them in court without conflicts.
Correct.
Yeah. And then keep it in mind too that oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead. I'll ask my question afterwards.
Also keep in mind that defendants have the ability to waive any conflicts of interest in order to ensure that the attorney they want defending them represents them. Where we would see a problem, I suppose, is if one's defense counsel may have represented a witness, a victim, or a co-defendant on a previous occasion, and so they hold confidences with somebody else. That might be a conflict that they just can't get around, and they would have to waive off representing Ms. Maxwell or somebody else.
Sure. So, Carlos, when I first approached you about coming on and talking about this case, you had said some things about wanting to highlight, victims' rights and several different things. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of go ahead and highlight that in the way that you wanted to when we were talking.
Oh, I appreciate that. Well, I think we have.
Carlos?
Yeah, he's there.
The one thing yes, I think that the one thing I would say is, when these sort of cases kind of hit the media, when they become public, we spend a lot of time as a society, I think, focusing on the accused or latching on to kind of sensational conduct that's alleged in the case. But behind every one of these cases is somebody who was victimized and who was brave enough at some point to reach out to a family member or to law enforcement and trust that we were going to do the right thing, investigating the case, and then hopefully bringing justice. Justice maybe to punish the person that committed the offense if they did, but also hopefully to deter the conduct so it doesn't happen again. And so as we talk about this and as you have future conversations, I guess the one thing I would encourage everybody who's listening to you, but also you is you have these discussions, which are great discussions for us as a society to have. I mean, we are all active citizens of this country. This is our criminal justice system, and we have to be informed and we have to be engaged. But engagement doesn't mean us doing or saying things that affect the rights of victims to have kind of their fair day in court, or the rights of the accused to defend themselves in court. And so that's about it. So long as we remember that somewhere out there is a victim, and that every time we see it in the news and we're another dump of information, this is fantastic. Yeah. Somewhere out there perhaps is a victim who was horrified by that same disclosure that my personal life, the worst moments of my life, are now going to be opened up for public consumption. And that's the challenge of the criminal justice system, I think, is to ensure that everybody's rights are protected, including that of victims through this process.
And we try to always allow for both sides. Like we've talked with Kathy Rubin, who was a victim of Ted Bundy, and allowed her to share her side of her, what happened to her, not just always focus on Ted, but this is what he did to his victims, and she's able to attest to what she experienced. So we try to always talk on both sides of that.
I think when we started out when we started out as a podcast, as a team, as everything, one of the things that we talked very heavily about was the sensationalism that seems to happen in media, with these types of cases, and that there is so much, as you said, Carlos, so much focus on these perpetrators and no focus on the victims, and that every single person in this, from victims to perpetrators, they're people and they all have rights, and they are all someone who somebody somewhere cares about, and so we took that very seriously. That was one of the things that we took, even showing, we started off with the Gypsy Rose Blanchard's case, as everybody knows, and we wanted to take that sensationalism out of that story and tell the actual whole truth, because you can look at, in that story especially, you can look at Dee Dee as a perpetrator and a victim. You can look at Gypsy Rose Blanchard as a perpetrator and a victim, and you can look at Nicholas Godejohn as a perpetrator and a victim. So it was a very unique case, and that was one of the things that we wanted to make sure, because Gypsy at one point in time brought up to me, I understand you've switched from just telling my story, you're going to focus on my mother's story as well, because we realized midway through that this was a larger story. It wasn't just Gypsy's story, it was Dee Dee's story, and if you didn't understand Dee Dee's story, who was the mother, you would never understand Gypsy's story fully. So she asked me specifically, she's like, I know that my mom did horrible things, but please remember that she's still my mother, and please don't just portray her as a monster. And my answer to her was I would never do that. I believe that your mother was created, which is one of the things we talk about on this show a lot, murder by design, in that your mother, there are circumstances that put your mother on the path that she was put on. And if some things had been changed in her life early on, we wouldn't be sitting here today doing what we're doing, So we've always tried to really stay with that. And that is something that we, going forward with all these cases, the Vallow case, this case, all the different ones we talk about, is very important to us here at Murder by Design, which is why we do have the guests that we have on here, because I believe that they, bring something to the table that you're not just getting from somebody,
the media
who just, the media, or just puts out something like Hulu's The Act, that was very sensationalized about Gypsy's case. And if they had taken the time to even just do a little more research, it would have been a better project, So that's why we're here. And I thank you guys both for joining us today.
We hope you can have you both back on again.
We would love to have you both back on.
This has been wonderful.
And yes,
if I could just say before I leave it in this discussion, and
absolutely,
is just this idea that, because defense attorneys are so often mischaracterized, and defense attorneys are very mindful, in my experience anyway, and maybe Carlos can back me up, but defense attorneys are very mindful of these things, the fact that there's victims and that sort of thing, and there's a deceased or an abuse, whatever it is. But that doesn't get displayed out in public because it's not part of the trial and everything else. And one of the difficulties of being a defense attorney is, and particularly in these high profile cases, is being cast as someone who's not mindful of the tragedy that's around them. And so I hope people will remember that going forward in this case, so they're not, threatening the attorneys like what happened to me or any of these other high profile cases, because defense attorneys, I've never encountered a defense attorney that endorses their conduct, the conduct of their client, but rather does the best to preserve the constitutional rights that protect us all, and while also being mindful of the tragedy around them. So I just wanted to squeak that in. I'm sorry.
No, you're right.
Right. And we definitely want to highlight that, so this week on the Good Wives Guide to True Crime, our podcast, today is Wicked Wednesday. So the second episode of Jodi Arias's saga has dropped today. The third one will be out next week, and it will be paired with an interview that we did with Kirk Nurmi. In that interview, it gave us a lot of perspective on the defense attorney and how they aren't this villain that some people make them out to be. People say, well, how do you sleep with yourself at night? How do you do these things? And it was a very real and honest look at this. And we are very excited to premiere that for you guys, because I can honestly say I went into that. And I think that Christina and Colleen, we all talked about going into that. We had a very different opinion of what we were going to end up talking with Kirk about, and how we were going to, I thought he was going to be a jerk. I mean, literally, I was like, oh, this guy's going to be a blowhard jerk, literally. And then within minutes of speaking with him, I was so enthralled and moved by the heart and the warmth that comes from him, and how kind and thoughtful, and how he explained that process of, especially in a case with Miss Arias, where you are clearly know that your client is not telling the truth, clearly, and then she turns on you, and she does all these things, and how gracefully you talk about that. And it gave me a new perspective on defense attorneys.
Just remember that, the defense attorneys, they're not defending the actions of the defendant. They're defending the constitutional rights of that defendant and trying to save a life, especially in states where the death penalty is there and life in prison without parole. So they're not defending the actions of Miss Maxwell being a pimp for pedophiles. They're defending her constitutional right. They don't agree with, sexual assault of children and rape of children and murder and selling of people, or, they don't defend with actions. They're defending constitutional rights. So I want people to know that defense attorneys are not this evil villain, who they endorse sexual assault or something. No, they're just defending just how they would defend us for anything that we have been charged with. They just want to defend our rights, not the actions that we have committed. Right. Kirk, is that essentially right?
Yeah. And I just, one thing that came to mind, I appreciate everything you said, Colleen, is that we also see this expanding into the world of judges, right? I don't know if you guys caught the statement made by the federal judge, his son was shot, right? About the protections and everything else. And it's heartbreaking. And this is the kind of thing, and I know we're going long here. I see the clock going long, but this is the kind of reality that we need to have some perspective on, because everyone involved is a human being and doing the best to keep our process, pristine and keep it the best process it is. And the threatening of judges or prosecutors or defense attorneys, and I'd say in my books, you're a terrorist if you do that, because you're threatening an institution of government. I mean, you're basically Tim McVeigh without the explosives, right? You're doing it on social media. So we all need to take a step back and understand the process and go about it with respect towards each other, and not this kind of bashing, if you will.
Sure. And Carlos, I'll open it up to you for final thoughts if you'd like. So that we'll close it out right after you finish here. So.
No, I think Kirk ended it exactly where it ought to. So I appreciate him. It was very enjoyable speaking with you today.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much, guys. I'm gonna go ahead and take you both out, and we'll close out the show. So thank you guys for tuning in. That was an amazing, I feel like that was one of the best things we've ever done here on Murder by Design, in my opinion. It was very heartwarming for me, for you guys to know, like I said, Carlos has been my friend for more than 30 years. We met his children, I'm very close with his brother, and I've almost been, part of their family for many years. And so having him on here to give such great commentary was very warm to my heart in the first place. And then to just hear what these two men had to say, and such knowledge and great wealth that they, of information that they gave us today. I'm just
right. It was very, very moving. I think, from the general perspective as civilians, we see, these sensationalized trials typically in a documentary or play out on court TV or the news, and you see a brief snip. But there is so much of a commentary, especially on social media, of how dare they defend the actions of this person, or while they're really overplaying the actions of the defense. I mean, it wasn't that bad. But we just have to remember that these are real people too. And their job is to uphold the Constitution and the laws, and they are doing their job to save and protect our civil and our rights as people. And so I love talking to them both, getting to usually we only talk to one or the other at a different time. We either talk to the investigators, or we talk to Kirk, or we talk to people in the investigative side. So having both a prosecutor and a defense attorney discuss those different points and look at what just happened. They agree with each other on pretty much everything. So they are not different people. they are just doing two different jobs, but they agree.
Yes. And if you haven't watched our other, earlier conversations with Joseph Scott Morgan, we did one a long time ago before the documents came out, or the interview that we did earlier this week with Cloyd and Joseph together. You definitely want to check those out, because that is what we bring to you, the table here on Murder by Design. There's a lot of true crime channels out there. There's a lot that discuss things and talk about things, but I believe that our experts are what sets us apart, and it really gives that extra information that we want to bring to you guys. We don't just want to report on these cases. We really want to try and help you understand, especially, I heard them talk about the fact of not reaching too far with cases with what they're charging with. And we've talked about that with Casey, in the Casey Anthony charges, understanding why Casey ended up going free, so this gives such a deeper understanding. And I really just thank every one of our experts that come on and spend time with us here. It is very, 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 very appreciated.
Valuable.
And guys, if people very much, please support them in other ways. Pick up their books, check out their websites, do all these different things to support them, because they are some incredible, incredible people. Now, there were some questions that got missed because I just didn't feel like they were questions for
this conversation.
the guest we had today, but let me go ahead. So Carla asked, what do you think about the judge's son being killed and her husband being hurt? And we did discuss this a little earlier this week. I think it's extremely tragic. I did a 15-minute episode, one of my true crime tidbits on it. And I'm willing, I want to see what happens in that case, because it puts out there to what's going to happen going forward in these other cases.
Right.
And it's very,
especially with like that case, we don't know if it was strictly just because of Epstein. There were other cases that lawyer worked with that judge about.
Yeah.
And the viewpoints of that lawyer who committed the crime. But also this plays into the fact that they did not redact the names and addresses of those investigators in this case. And these are very powerful men and women involved in this case. Mm-hmm. And it has put their lives in jeopardy. Obviously, we saw somebody posed as a FedEx agent and then shot and tried to kill the judge, but killed her son and severely injured her husband. So this is something that we talked briefly about on Monday, about how are we going to protect these investigators now that their information is out, in terms of witness protection or having protection placed on them and their property. And so definitely check out our Monday conversation, because we really got into that conversation with our investigators.
Right. And these are people that put their lives on the line every day. And now it's even more on the line, Another question that Elaine had was, what kind of life will Ghislaine be living going on? She's heard that they're wearing paper clothing, etc., moving cell sites. Why didn't she just stay in France? So some of that is, we can address the fact of wearing the paper clothing, moving cell sites. All of that is very normal. It's a normal process. It's not anything different for her. I do assume that there's probably a little more security involved in protecting her
after Epstein,
especially in the light of Epstein's not suicide. We've all seen the meme going around that I just want to go on record today and say that Ghislaine
did not kill herself next week.
Not kill herself, right? So exactly. So we've seen that, but that is what she's going through. Those different things, they are very normal. And a good question is, why didn't she just stay in France? We've asked this several times. It is mind-boggling. Cocky. I think she really believed, because Epstein was gone, that she was clear. And I think she thought that they took out the guy, and so I'm just a lowly, friend of his, and they're not going to touch me. That's my opinion. # my opinion.
Well, and right, there's other stuff happening right now in our country and in other countries that there's COVID, there's just unemployment. There's the news is dominated by a million other things every day. So I think she thought she could just sneak in here and be able to kind of get away with that and be unnoticed. I guess she didn't think that the feds had been watching her for years, waiting for her to slip up and make this mistake, which she did. And honestly, I'm happy that she slipped up, because justice has to be served for these victims. Justice needs to be served. And I'm hoping, like Kirk and Carlos said, I'm hoping that, there are ways that they'll get information to be able to get, charge the people who were more involved. Like obviously
Yes.
Ghislaine, was a pimp procuring, victims from
Yes.
all over the world to be sex trafficked and abused by men and women of high power and not high power, I'm sure. So she obviously deserves to be charged and thrown in jail. But to me, the people who committed those atrocities on those children, to me, they're worse. And just like how Carlos said that a murder is like finalized, it's very hard for families, but we hope that they go on to a better place and whatever they believe happens after. But a person who is assaulted, especially in a sex crime and especially children, they die every day living with that, and a lot of them do end up either committing crimes themselves as adults or committing suicide because it's too hard to live with. So they've severely damaged hundreds of girls, and the way it is playing out in things now, especially in the media, where these girls are now being questioned in their motives and made to be blamed for things, and they're defending their own actions, like, oh, well, maybe the statutory rape limit should only be 14, not 16. Like, you're disgusting. You assaulted a child. And I hope that there is enough evidence that can be brought against these perpetrators. Sex crimes in general are horrific, and perpetrated against children is a horror.
Right. Pedophilia and molestation is not a sexual preference that is acceptable in any way. I know that we've seen it going around right now in social media, the lobbying for this to be somehow included in an alternative lifestyle.
No.
That is not in any way, shape, or form acceptable. It will never be acceptable, in my opinion.
There's no consent.
And there is, somebody said something about, I identify as an 8-year-old, so I'm attracted to 8-year-olds. Well, I don't know any 8-year-old that wants to have sex with another 8-year-old. I'm sorry, I just don't. So I don't believe that. And I'm very highly upset about these things that are going around right now, lobbying for this, TED Talks on it. It's been very disturbing. It has been something that we have been talking about, even in, the light of, people talking about Wayfair, people talking about this, people talking about, the celebrities that are involved in all these different things. And we have talked about it extensively, that we believe that this is very far reaching and very wide. And it's going to take a very long time for all of this to come to some sort of conclusion, resolution, what have you. So we will be following along as things come out. And then, there's other cases that we are following closely right now. We did do some coverage this week on the Vallow case. I will be doing an update at some point in time, either Thursday or Friday, on the outcome of the Daybell trial or the preliminary hearing. And that is one that I would love to have some of our attorneys back on and talk about it at a later time, because what we saw
pre-trial
happen
hearing has been
weird, super amount. I've never seen a defense or a prosecution lay that out like that in a preliminary.
It's showing the cards. It's a lot.
However, I can say he accomplished his goal. They are going to trial. So at least is, and I assume will go somewhat of the same nature.
Right. And so that leads to the point of, please check out our membership website and on our Patreon. I have been uploading the documents related to many of our cases, but specifically the Epstein documents. So there are thousands of pages of these documents, including the unredacted versions, on our Patreon, including the documents of Epstein's cases back in Palm Beach, but also in New York. All of the depositions and the memoirs written by the victims. So all of those are out, some charges that were brought against Epstein in the 90s as well. All of those are on our Patreon and our membership website. So please, if you are interested in actually reading what we have out there and, all in one succinct spot, please go check out that information. That way, we have it, it's verified. It's not, a falsified document or anything that you potentially finding on Reddit or something. This is actual documents.
And on that site, you can find our podcasts that we release every Wednesday. You can also find our blog posts. there is a blog post that Christina's working on right now about the Vallow case and what happened in the courts for the 2 days that the preliminary hearing was happening. We cover all kinds of different things on there, and we're going to be working on getting a newsletter together. There's a lot of stuff that's coming out of there, as well as being able to see the other podcasts that we're going to be launching here in October and beyond, and the other projects that we work on as a team away from just true crime. So there's a lot that you guys can see there. We thank you so very much for tuning in and joining us today. I know this was a little bit longer than a 15-minute true crime tidbit for Wednesday, but I felt it was very worth it. So you guys have a wonderful rest of your week. We will see you on Friday, and we will have some more good stuff for you. Okay. And then come back next week on Mondays. My stupid dog. On Mondays, Colleen, can you tell them what we're doing on Monday so I can mute so they can hear you?
So on Mondays, we release our Murder by Design videos that come out every Monday. Our Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we have our true crime tidbits. And then on Wednesdays is when we drop our Wicked Wednesday podcast for our Good Wives Guide to True Crime. I don't read lips, girl.
Case that we're covering on Monday.
So we are covering the Laura Bible Ashley Freeman case out of Welch, Oklahoma, which we interviewed Jax Miller, who is the writer of Hell in the Heartland. She was also in the show. We talked about briefly this on Monday when we did a little teaser of what the case is about and how it is not available on streaming anymore because there will be doing an update because some major developments have happened this year, and it specifically will be happening this month. And so at the end of the month, we're going to wrap it up to give you the current, literally up-to-date new information that has come out. We are following it very closely. You're going to want to tune in. This is a case that we, especially me, I'm very fascinated about. And we will be covering the investigative portion and how missing people go out with our Gone Cold Missing People with Todd Matthews podcast that will start in October.
Yep. And we've just got a lot coming out. We've even got an entertainment podcast that's going to come out that's going to rock your world because it's going to be so incredibly intuitive. And we have such great guests lined up for everything. So guys are going to want to keep coming back. Have a wonderful rest of your week.